How are you, Publius?
Doing quite well, Mod. How are you?
I'm very well. Uh, had a
I
good week.
apologize for any potential background noise on this end. I'm not in the quietest spot, unfortunately.
Sounds good to me. So that's fine. I also apologize for any inconvenience in starting this class later than the usual. But here we are. Publius, I wanted to start maybe this class by looking back into it's exactly a month since Beanstalk's unpause, and we have a little bit of more data that we can look back into and see, how the protocol has performed, since unpause. And I'm going to go through, quickly a few things, and maybe we can discuss what we think is a bit interesting. So a month since unpause, Bean is pegged. The bean supply on unpause was at around 23.6 million. It's at 31.5 million. So we've had around 7 million of an extra, let's say, increase in supply of bean, and that's around 25% of the total supply when Beanstalk unpaused. What do you think about that in specific? Since just the bean supply increasing at that rate in 1 month.
So I'm going to take the numbers that you gave as accurate, although I didn't check them in advance. So assuming that they are accurate in terms of the supply growth, the past month has been quite, from our perspective, quite exciting. When you consider that the ultimate plan that was decided on by the DAO to replant Beanstalk was effectively the riskiest plan from a peg maintenance perspective, but in the short term, let's call it, but maybe the least risky from a long-term perspective because of the fact that, as was spoken about prior to the replant, the current plan was sort of throwing the protocol to the wolves, and with keeping all of its old debt, issuing new debt, scaling down the supply significantly, that put Beanstalk in a position where it was an open-ended question as to how the market would receive it. And in short, the growth in market cap from the low 20s to the low 30s in the first week of replant, and then the stabilization in the low 30s thereafter, that's been generally a very promising first sign as Beanstalk starts to re-demonstrate itself as credit worthy. So from our perspective, this is still very early days. To some extent, the fact that the protocol does not have on-chain governance yet means that the real Lindy effect for beans becoming money still probably hasn't quite started taking hold yet. So there is still a lot of work to be done to continue to improve the protocol to get it to a place where the Lindy effect can really start to take hold, because structurally there aren't going to need to be major changes to the protocol at some point. So the first month, generally pretty exciting. Other things that in our opinion are noteworthy are generally how the demand for soil has been. That it seems that every season all of the soil, albeit very little, has been sown, indicating that even as the temperature continues to decrease, there is demand to lend to the protocol. The fact that there's so little soil, on the one hand, means that the effective temperature received for lending to the protocol is actually lower, but it also means that perhaps the data in terms of sample size isn't large enough for Beanstalk to really evaluate what the optimal weather should be. But nonetheless, the fact that the protocol has not issued a significant increase in a significant amount of debt, we should say, that's generally an indication that the current and updated soil parameters are generally doing pretty well. So all things considered, this has been a relatively calm first month, and no news is good news from that perspective. So Beanstalk continuing to oscillate the bean price above and below the peg. It's pretty good from our perspective, and there's been a little bit of upside volatility upon replant. There's been a little bit of downside volatility in the weeks thereafter, but generally things have been pretty pegged. So I think it'll be interesting to see at some point, once there's a liquidity trading against ETH, how that contributes to the volatility in the bean price, because right now trading against stable assets, there's basically no volatility, we should say. So that's some preliminary analysis. There haven't been any chops yet, so perhaps there hasn't been any sort of capitulation from older participants in the system that they want to just take their money and leave, which is very interesting from a behavioral perspective in terms of confidence and willingness to wait. So all very interesting stuff to look at. And generally, the fact that the protocol is on and healthy after a month is very exciting.
Yeah. And the bean mints, or the increase in bean supply, comes from a few sources. One of them is due to the shortage, let's say, of beans in the liquidity pool, and then from recapitalization of selling fert, and then lastly from budget mints. But the majority of that, I estimated at around 80% or so, came from a shortage of beans. So Beanstalk minting and distributing those beans. I know that you described it relatively calm, and it may seem calm, but to me, that's a big increase in bean supply, and having the pod rate relatively unchanged is quite impressive, in my opinion. Expanding the supply to that point, and at the same time still maintaining or not, taking any amount of that to absorb, let's say, any volatility that's in the system.
Well, I think maybe the reason to classify it as calm is because the initial growth in the bean supply was, and it wasn't determined to what extent the bean supply would grow, but the fact that the protocol replanted with a price above 1 did mean that there was going to be some minting. So perhaps on this end, not as impressed with the growth in the bean supply, but certainly are impressed by the low volatility in the peg crosses.
Yeah. And with 22% FERT sold, how do you feel about that?
Well, the current structure of the barn race is such that Beanstalk really doesn't care what how long it takes for all of the fertilizer to be sold. As sort of expected, the demand for fertilizer really started to evaporate as the humidity decreased, and that makes a lot of sense. There was a little bit of demand for soil with the very high humidities after replant, but thereafter there was a major drop-off in demand for fertilizer, and that was pretty much expected, and the thought being that whenever all of the current fertilizer is paid back and fertilizes all of its sprouts, at that point it'll once again make sense to purchase fertilizer. So for the time being, no surprise or change in expectations on how things are going on the barn race front. The expectation is probably that there won't be too much more participation in the barn race for the foreseeable future, but nothing out of the ordinary on that front at the moment from our perspective.
All right. Okay, let's move to another topic or an update that has happened the past few days, which is let's say a bug or a potential exploit that Halburn has found or assessed. Publius, can you give us a summary of what was that exploit, and how did we come to know about it, and then what actions are taken, and will it, how will that also impact the protocol in the future?
Sure. So to be perfectly frank, since we were made aware of the bug, I personally have not had a chance to look at the bug closely. So I'm to some extent ignorant of how the bug worked. But what I do know and can comment about is that the vulnerability had to do with the chop function. And in practice, what happened was that yesterday, midday, Halborn alerted in the Beanstalk Slack, where they do the communications around the security audit. They notified everyone in the channel of a vulnerability, and that the vulnerability was needed to be fixed urgently, and that the vulnerability was in the chop function. And so in response, the BCM moved to, as quickly as possible, remove the chop function from the contract, which in total, I think from the time that Halborn notified the Slack of the issue until the BCM removed the function and therefore remedied the issue, or at least removed the issue, was about an hour and a half turnaround. So generally, that's a pretty good turnaround in terms of when you think about the current structure of the ownership and control of Beanstalk. Prior to the exploit, ownership was 100% controlled by Publius, and so the fact that the BCM was still able to act very quickly, given the time-sensitive nature of the issue, that was pretty encouraging. And Halborn was watching it in real time and then sent another message in the Slack, even before they could be notified that the function was removed, that they saw it was removed and that all was clear. So since then, we've been coordinating with them on a fix to the issue. The thought being that the BCM will re-implement the chop function as soon as possible, hopefully in the next 24 to 48 hours, it'll be ready to go. And once Halborn signs off, that will allow for the re-implementation of the chop function.
And will the BCM need to introduce this as a BIP, or it'll just be pushed on chain?
As of now, the expectation is that the BIP will just be pushed on chain by the BCM as it's part of a bug fix.
Okay. All right. Let's take some of the questions that are in the town hall chat. Starting with Austin's question, who asks, "How are you doing, Publius?"
I think we're doing great. So from our perspective, the fact that the protocol has been on for a month is very exciting. And to be quite frank, we're very enthused at all the work there is to do. So if you think about Beanstalk as a base layer or a base issuer of money for DeFi, ultimately the utility of that money will be facilitated through the integration of various technologies with the silo, because the competitive carry on Beans comes from depositing assets in the silo. So from our perspective, there's just so much to be done on and around the Beanstalk economy that it seems like there's infinite cool stuff to build. So how are we doing? We're so thrilled to be having really cool conversations with entrepreneurs and developers that are trying to build different things on and around Beanstalk and the silo. So generally, how we're doing tends to be highly correlated with how Beanstalk is doing, and at the moment, we're very thrilled with how things are going.
I'm glad to hear that. I remember your saying of, as long as being pegged, all is well.
Life is simple that way.
Agreed. Speaking of things that can be done on Beanstalk, or the work that is being going on, Harry asks about BIP24 and BIP25. Do you have any update?
So from a timing perspective on BIP24, that is currently being audited. And so unclear on exactly what the timing is, but the hope is by either end of this week or next week to have that audit stream on BIP24 completed, at which point, in theory, the BIP should be ready for formal proposal. Now, given that this is the first BIP that has been audited by Halborn, not exactly sure on the timeline and the order of operations there around completion of the stream and getting it ready for formal proposal. But the thought would be that'll be in the next couple weeks, probably 2 weeks, let's call it. That's our hopeful or expected timeline on BIP24 at this point.
And 25? That's the DEX.
So the timeline around the implementation of the instead of calling it the DEX, I think it might be more accurate to refer to it as like a Beanstalk AMM, because to some extent the pods already are part of the Beanstalk DEX, right? So lots of different assets can trade on DEXs. The Beanstalk DEX hopefully will support the trading of a wide variety of types of assets, but the wells, which I think is what Harry was referring to with BIP25, those will be, at least to start, between ERC20 tokens. And originally the hope was to have that ready for audit in the next 2 weeks. But as we've continued to think about how best to implement Beanstalk native AMMs, the most important piece of the AMM is how to implement the oracles for the AMM, specifically as it relates to conversions and minting for Beanstalk and the silo. And we're probably inclined to spend more development time building a more sophisticated Oracle system for the Beanstalk AMM system up front than to roll out sort of a preliminary AMM and then upgrade the Oracle system over time. So at this point, don't have an exact timeline, but hopefully in the next week or two, we'll have a lot more content on the specifics of how the Beanstalk AMM Oracle system should probably work.
All right. You mentioned earlier that the chop function hasn't been used, and you thought that was an interesting behavior. We've also seen some OTC deals happening. Maybe I have seen more of them lately, but I don't know exactly how much in total has happened, or when did they start? Let's say. What are your thoughts in general on OTC deals, and what do you think that impacts Beanstalk in general?
So OTC, or over-the-counter trading, is commonplace in any market where there isn't a liquid exchange. And it's even common in some markets where there are liquid exchanges. So in practice, there's nothing wrong with OTC trading. And if you look at the history of Beanstalk, there used to be, it wasn't super active, but there was an OTC market for pods in the Discord. And it's worth noting that one of the members of the community, and again, I'm sorry about the background noise if it's particularly loud, but one of the members of the community was actually defrauded using the OTC pod marketplace and lost something like 50,000 pods, if I recall correctly. So OTC trading comes with a lot of additional risks relative to trading on chain, but it can be helpful to get liquidity if there's no liquid on-chain exchange. So I think we would just use this as an opportunity to caution anyone trading OTC to be sure who your counterparty is, or to try to minimize counterparty risk as much as possible, and recognize that the risks of trading OTC are significantly different than the risks of using an on-chain exchange or even an off-chain exchange.
And do you think that OTC deals generally happen are favorable to the protocol? So moving those assets from one person to another who's buying it, does that kind of flush the system to an extent?
So on the one, let's compare user behavior. On the one hand, if someone were to chop and liquidate their assets, they're basically collecting value at the moment, which would create sell pressure for Beans in the short term, but minimize the long-term need for Beanstalk to recapitalize itself. And so there's some sort of trade-off there from Beanstalk's perspective, where on the one hand, it's short-term value leaving the system in exchange for the decrease in need to create longer-term value, let's call it. So the future obligations of the protocol are lessened if people chop. So Beanstalk is perfectly comfortable if people chop, but on the other hand, if somebody wants to buy the unripe assets and therefore hold it longer than the person that would have chopped it, so they're providing some liquidity instead of to the person who was going to chop, the only difference from Beanstalk's perspective is that its total future obligations are greater if less assets are chopped. And so at the margin, it probably doesn't make a difference to the protocol one way or another. And this is a good time to just restate that Beanstalk is designed in a way where it assumes people are acting in their own best interest and not in the interest of the protocol. And whether people are chopping or trying to liquidate their unripe assets on a secondary market, it doesn't really affect Beanstalk. And that's in line with that design choice, or design goal, we should say.
Okay. Austin asks, what is the thinking for the amount of seeds to be awarded to the Bean ETH pool? Will it be more than the Bean 3 curve? For instance, 5 seeds?
So on the one hand, frankly, haven't given too much thought to the seeds per BDV for the Bean ETH pool as compared to the Bean 3 curve pool. But the reason for that is that over time, and it's unclear exactly when this should happen, but it probably makes sense to shift the seeds per BDV system to not be the thing that is set by the DAO, but be a derivative of the thing that is set by the DAO. So currently, the DAO determines the seeds per BDV, which is basically the relative payment in grown stock for a given deposited whitelisted asset. And that's fine, but in theory, it may make more sense for the DAO to set target percentages. So of the assets that are whitelisted for deposit in the silo, instead of setting seeds per BDV, it may make more sense for the DAO to set desired exposure percentages, where it could be 50% ETH and 50% 3 curve. And then the way the silo would work in terms of seeds per BDV is over time, if there's too much exposure to 3 curve and not enough exposure to ETH, then the ratio of seeds per BDV should increase for ETH and decrease for 3 curve relative to one another to increase the desire or the attractiveness to hold ETH exposure within the silo. So it's therefore the seeds per BDV become a derivative of what the DAO actually cares about, which is exposure to any given cryptocurrency. So not sure on timing for when that will be ready to be implemented, and it's probably not going to be ready prior to the first couple of wells that are ready to roll out, like the Bean ETH well. So it at some point, it probably will make sense to have that conversation when seeds per BDV for the Bean ETH pool relative to the Bean 3 curve pool, but haven't given it too much thought at the moment.
I like the thought of this. So some sort of balancing mechanism that adjusts basically the liquidity according to what the DAO has decided initially. I think that'll be interesting to see it in action with the AMM as well. Okay, building up on the seeds question. Don't remember who asked that or where did I see it, but what are your thoughts about putting a cap on the amount of stock that a seed can grow?
So, well, first off, I've never really considered that, so I'm thinking out loud here. But first off, there is no, from Beanstalk's perspective, the linear growth of stock from seeds doesn't matter over shorter periods of time. It's unclear whether over decades it becomes an issue. So the real question being asked is there a point at which the opportunity cost from forfeiting grown stock from seeds becomes sufficiently large such that there's no need to issue additional grown stock from seeds? And I mean, first reaction would be that there probably is some point at which that is the case, but it's not clear how to easily have Beanstalk measure what that point is. And therefore, for the time being, it probably doesn't make sense to implement a cap on the grown stock per seed or per BDV. But it's something that probably should warrant some more thought and discussion. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I think the challenge with a cap on the seeds is that, you know, the percentage of people who have, or the participants who have reached the maximum amount of stock that can be grown will not have much of an incentive to participate and convert. Maybe not so true, but you know, they won't. There is no, you know, point in getting 4 seeds or 2 seeds because I've already maxed what I've got.
Well, I think that While it's not untrue, I think that that's a type of friction that should get resolved through the auto seed adjustment system, whereby then, if there's an unwillingness to convert, Beanstalk should be able to work around that by adjusting the seeds per BDV. But your point is well taken.
And the other part of, let's say, there's a lot of stock concentration, and then the silo is not attractive anymore. I think that the system will balance itself as well. If it's really unattractive, then naturally people will leave, as that growing stock doesn't add that much, and there will be some balance point. But I agree with you. Maybe some more thought put into this could get up some better ideas. Okay, Thunderbreaker asks.
I think that the case the answer for this will really play out is the bank run, right? In a heavy bank run, how does the fact that you have capped the grown stock on seeds affect people's willingness to stay in the system? That's an open question, but that would probably be the one to primarily consider.
Agreed. Agreed. Since this is the purpose of the seeds to begin with. Thunderbreaker asks if the DEX or the AMM contract could be audited before it goes live.
That is certainly our hope. So from our perspective, it would be quite prudent to have Halborn audit any of the BIPs prior to proposal. Now, there's nothing that can stop anyone from proposing a BIP that hasn't been audited, but from our perspective, it would certainly be prudent to have it audited first.
Canadian Bennett asks if there are any updates on stock being liquid.
So not from a timing perspective, other than perhaps that the liquid stock and liquid seeds, because you can probably make seeds liquid in either an 1155 or where you have different seed types depending on the asset that they're associated with. Both stock as an ERC20 and seeds as an 1155 potentially could be implemented around the same time that the variable seeds per BDV system could be implemented, let's call it. So this is all part of the seed liquidity, stock liquidity, the updated gauge. I don't know if you want to call it a gauge system, but a seed gauge system. That's all part of like a silo V3, and maybe it's not a silo V3, but it's probably a couple months away.
There sure is a lot of work to be done. Iril asks, is it possible to use deposited beans for gas? And I'm assuming, Iril, here you mean that the user just signs the transaction and then Beanstalk uses their deposits as gas and push things on the blockchain.
So yes and no. No, because at the end of the day, you need ETH to transact on the ETH network, and therefore you need some base ETH to facilitate the sale of beans into ETH to pay the gas fees. But yes, from a UX perspective, you could, in theory, facilitate the sale of beans into ETH to pay the gas, but it's unclear that would actually be the best UX because of the gas fee associated with the sale of beans into ETH. So it may not make sense to do it every time. But that's more of a UX question than it is a Beanstalk protocol question, because you still need ETH to transact on the Ethereum network, not ETH. It probably becomes easier to do that once there's no withdrawal freeze from Silo.
Austin asks a follow-up question on the seeds discussion. If any changes, let's say, that happen to the seed system, whether it's the gauge or anything else, how would that impact existing, let's say, stockholders, or will it only impact new ones?
The expectation would be it would affect all deposits. It's unclear in exactly what capacity. For example, one open question is whether stock and seeds per BDV and BDV only update upon interaction with the silo or every block or every season. things like that have certainly not been ironed out. So it's hard to say more specifically, other than the expectation would be that every deposit would be part of the system now, or every whitelisted asset.
The next question asks if the AMM is going to be a general purpose AMM or only for some, whitelisted assets, let's say, or selected assets.
So at the end of the day, this is for the market to decide. Our hope and expectation would be that because beans are positive carry, they present a very attractive asset to trade against. And therefore, it may be very attractive for other protocols to have a whitelisted bean pair in the silo. But on the other hand, it's not possible to have like an open whitelist because somebody could create their own cryptocurrency and then basically use their minting ability or control over the currency to manipulate their share of the seigniorage from Beanstalk in practice. Because if they control all of the supply of the currency and they have lots of beans, they can manipulate the BDV of their currency pretty heavily and therefore manipulate the silo. So the thought is the whitelist will still have to exist, but the hope is to implement the system in a way such that lots of different assets can trade against beans, take advantage of the zero fee AMM. And maybe just as a commentary note, in practice, utility for trading on an exchange isn't just a function of trading fees, it's also a function of liquidity depth. Because if there's not a sufficient amount of depth of liquidity, the price slippage is going to also factor into your effective price, and that's also not good. So it's not just about zero fees, it's also about having deepest liquidity, and that's where implementing a world-class AMM in the spirit of the pod marketplace, where there's arbitrary curves that people can place bids or offers at, that's something that's very exciting to us, and we think that can help make the Beanstalk AMM really robust to attract liquidity for not just a couple trading pairs, but lots of different trading pairs.
And the part on the liquidity depth bit, I think Brian did some examples or numbers calculating how having no fee versus a much larger liquidity pool, how a smaller one but without fees would compare or be more efficient to it. Don't remember the actual numbers, but they were quite eye-opening. And to add to that as well, anyone will be able to have a well, and it doesn't have to trade against Bean. But the wells that will be in the silo are only the ones that are whitelisted. So not every well that's on the AMM will be whitelisted. But anyone can start their own. Sweet Red Beans asks, what do you think about Beanstalk in the context of devaluation of the USD? I'm not sure if I understand this question. Maybe it means as the US dollar devalues, how does Beanstalk react?
So I think you're correct. Generally, an inflationary environment for the US dollar serves as a tailwind for Beanstalk, because if you think about the outstanding, I don't know if liabilities are the right way to think about it, but the outstanding obligations of Beanstalk as the USD value of the beans at peg, the concept is that as the value of USD decreases, that should make it easier for Beanstalk to attract enough value to keep the beans at their peg. So in practice, it's unclear how much that actually plays out. Right now, the fact that beans trade exclusively against other USD stablecoins means that it's less likely that Beanstalk actually feels that tailwind in the short term, but perhaps over the long term, a devaluing US dollar is still, from a macro perspective, good for Beanstalk because it decreases its obligations. The main question from Beanstalk's perspective is just what is the value of the liquidity trading against beans and the current equilibrium price in those AMMs. So as beans start to trade against other assets, particularly assets that may demonstrate devaluation of the US dollar through the increase in dollar value of their prices, at that point you might expect Beanstalk to experience more short-term tailwinds from the devaluation of the US dollar. So the introduction of a Bean ETH pool, that would probably be the first step in having Beanstalk benefit a little bit more from the devaluation of the dollar, and then perhaps having beans trade against more real assets. That's really at the point at which you would start to see Beanstalk experience more and more of those tailwinds. So the more assets that beans trade against that will reflect the devaluation of the dollar by increasing in dollar value, that's how Beanstalk most clearly benefits.
Sweet Red Beans, that was sufficient answer, or if it wasn't, let us know and we can expand on it. And he sends a thumbs up. Bean Bankman Refried asks, what are your thoughts on an L2 deployment at this time? And if it's not anytime soon, then what milestones do you think it will be to then consider an L2?
Hey, sorry, I booted myself by accident. The short answer is that the exact timing on L2 is unclear, particularly because there's so much development happening on L2 at the moment, and the optimal strategy for Beanstalk on L2s still really hasn't quite presented itself, particularly because just the potential for how a zero knowledge L2 really affects Beanstalk is so profound that it's almost like, it's hard to focus on short-term L2 solutions because it's almost a distraction. There's enough work to be done on L1 Beanstalk that waiting a little bit for a little bit more development on the L2 side is an attractive thing to do. But with that said, there's actually a call that Sweet Red Beans set up with Optimism happening next Monday. So perhaps, and I think the thought is now that Beanstalk is back on, sort of recommence conversing with various L2s and see their interest in Beanstalk and kind of take it from there. So there hasn't been too much thought on that front, to be frank, because there's so much to do on L1, and the L2 deployment we don't expect it to be particularly complicated. The main question, at least at the moment, is around how to ensure that there's liquidity on the layer 2. And to talk a little bit more about it, the implementation of BIP 24 is really the first step in the direction of having a fungible version of silo assets. And the thought is that it might make the most sense to have Beanstalk try to attract liquidity for specific fungible versions of deposited assets on the L2, such that people can carry, they can have beans with the positive carry on the L2, and then from an implementation perspective, there shouldn't be too much complexity around bridging your beans to an L2, adding them to a liquidity pool on the L2, and then bridging those LP tokens back to layer 1 to deposit them in the silos. So that's probably what the V0 of a layer 2 implementation looks like for Beanstalk, but it's definitely still a ways away.
A follow-up to that question from Austin asks, what will actually get deployed on an L2? So why L2?
Yeah, so in the version of an L2 integration that we just described, there wouldn't need to be anything specifically from a Beanstalk specific perspective deployed on the L2, because all the silo interactions would still be happening on L1. The question then becomes, what are the L2 fungible assets being used for? And that would likely require either the integration of the fungible assets into existing DeFi protocols or the deployment of new Beanstalk-specific DeFi protocol. But in terms of Beanstalk itself, at least for the time being, the hope is to minimize the amount of development that needs to actually happen on the L2 and keep Beanstalk itself on L1 for the moment.
Okay, and while we're at layers, Nasdaq asks, what about Beanstalk having its own, chain, Bean chain?
That's a great question, one which perhaps doesn't have a good answer. This speaks to the kind of a first principles question as to whether it is best for the asset that is securing the network to be distinct from the money of that network. So in the case of the Ethereum network, particularly when it transitions to proof of stake, Ether becomes the asset that is providing the security for the chain exclusively. And I think in practice, we saw that the security of the Terra blockchain was compromised when the price of the Terra asset started to collapse, and Beanstalk is designed to be resistant to major bank runs and short-term price collapses, but it assumes the security of the Ethereum network and therefore the time with which to operate to attract enough creditors to return the Bean price to $1. So that security assumption is jeopardized if the value that is securing the network is also the currency's the protocol's currency. Now, it is worth saying that at scale, assuming that the vast majority of ETH or staked ETH is trading against Beans and in the silo, you still sort of have this problem where a major decrease in demand for Beans would probably result in a major decrease in the price of Ethereum and therefore a major decrease in the cost to attack the Ethereum network. But perhaps those risks are still better abstracted at a different layer with a different currency with a slightly different value proposition than Beans themselves. But that is a question that will likely be asked again and again in the coming years, assuming that Beanstalk continues to do well.
What do you think are the challenges with something like that? Is it just because it may not be worth it at the moment, or do you think there are technical challenges to do something like that?
Can you clarify what you mean? I'm not sure I answered the question.
If let's say we decide, or the DAO decides that, hey, let's start our chain, can we do it, but we only don't want to do it because we don't think it's worth it right now, or we can't do something like that at the moment, and it may take us, I don't know, maybe years to get this thing up and running?
L1 is a gargantuan task, and separate from the DAO deciding it makes sense to develop an L1, the actual implementation of an L1 is a massive task. And frankly, in practice, what's more likely to happen is the development of an L1 that is basically done, and then the DAO votes to transition the state of Beanstalk to that L1 in some capacity. But the concept of developing L1 in advance, it's just such a big project. It's not top of mind at this point. So for the moment, at least, it's hard to see that happening.
All right. Nasdaq lastly asks, how are you thinking about attracting more engineering talent to Beanstalk?
So, frankly, we think that Beanstalk has done an amazing job of attracting high-quality engineering talent, and we hope that for similar reasons it will continue to attract high quality engineering talent. So why do we think Beanstalk has attracted high quality engineering talent thus far? It's a combination of something very fast paced and intellectually stimulating to work on, with the potential for a significant amount of monetary gain in the instance that the protocol works. And that general proposition doesn't seem to be changing anytime in the near future. And as far as we can tell, development resources at this point are not really the main thing holding back the development of Beanstalk. Developing good stuff takes a lot of time, and I think the real question is how to start compelling engineers to build on top of Beanstalk as opposed to Beanstalk itself. And more Beanstalk devs is great on all parts of the stack, but perhaps the time has also come to start asking the question as to how to encourage attracting devs on top of Beanstalk. And Beansprout and Mr. Manifold to do a job of that, but the reality is that as Beanstalk continues to prove itself, we expect that more people will realize the potential upside if it works, and reevaluate the chances that does happen and decide at some point it makes sense for them to start building on Beanstalk. So economically, we view it as somewhat inevitable, assuming that Beanstalk continues to work, that protocols will start to build on top of Beanstalk, because in order to compete with traditional businesses, protocols need, or compete for traditional businesses to use them, protocols need to use Beans because of their positive carry. So the short answer is, at least for the time being, there isn't much of an active movement to recruit new dev talent as much as there is a continued sifting process through the many inbound interests and people looking to work on Beans in some capacity to find people that are going to build really cool stuff.
Austin asks, how has your thinking changed about Beanstalk's ability to issue other pegged assets besides, Bean?
So there's a couple of things. The first is that as long as the credit of Beanstalk is strong, the protocol is able to attract lenders, there's no reason that the protocol can't, in theory, issue assets that are pegged to other denominations. In practice, if the protocol if the same Beanstalk is going to issue different pegged assets, it's one credit history, and so the price of any one bean, whether it's a USD bean or a BTC bean or whatever have you, they're all going to be highly correlated in terms of their relationships to that, because they're all related to the same credit history or backed by the same credit. So from that perspective, there's the main question to consider. There's some specifics on implementation which haven't been specifically worked out, but the real question to consider is related to the question Sweet Red Beans asked around how the devaluation of the USD affects Beanstalk, which is that issuing assets or obligations or liabilities, however you want to think about it, that are expected to decrease in real world value in the future is a different proposal from Beanstalk's perspective than issuing assets that are expected to increase in real world value. Now, what is real world value? That's hard to define per se, but I think that's really the main question: is which assets is it appropriate for Beanstalk to issue against? And to some extent, the more diversified the basket of goods that Beanstalk has as an exposure, in a similar way to the more diversified the liquidity that Beans trade against, the more resilient the protocol is. You could make an argument that the more diversified the obligations of the protocol, similarly the better off it is. So don't have too many specific comments at the moment as to when that makes sense to do. Don't think it's for the foreseeable future, given that the market seems to, at the moment, still demand by a wide margin dollars on chain more than any other asset. But if the market demands other assets as well, it seems possible that Beanstalk could fulfill that demand as well using the same credit history.
Okay. I think we are at the end of the town hall chat. I see Sweet Red Beans is typing, so we'll give it a minute and see if there are more questions. Sweet Red Beans saved his to next week. Austin asks, what, if any, are some low-hanging fruit ideas that you'd love to see built on top of Beanstalk?
The low-hanging fruit, and there's not that much of it, to be frank, are the current pieces of DeFi that have demonstrated product market fit. So what are they? We would really classify them as three different things. You have AMMs, you have money markets, and you have CDPs. So those are the first three things that really make sense as low-hanging fruit to build on top of Beanstalk. And then there's some higher-hanging fruit, like the idea for, I guess it's just a part of the money market, ultimately, the mod presented a couple classes back, but more and more sophisticated implementations of AMMs, CDPs, and money markets. That's probably the lowest hanging fruit, where the use of them starts to become more attractive because of the seigniorage. But the reality is that it's just those are the tools that have proven themselves as useful in DeFi thus far, and they do need to ultimately be built on top of Beanstalk. So the implementation of each of them non-trivial in their own right in order to implement them as best as possible, but those are probably the first couple of things to, particularly if you're asking about low-hanging fruit, that's probably there. I
think this is what creates a mature market, and a mature market is what facilitates and enables utility. So as these markets or things get built on top of it, there will be more and more things that can be done, in the Bean economy. Cool Bean asks, what are the biggest things everyone in the community can do to help rebuild momentum? So one thing it's really hard, I think, in the moment to remember, but it's important to remember, is that Beanstalk has gone through many waves of significant inflows and significant outflows, and then long periods of stasis or equilibrium where there's neither inflows nor outflows. And the thing that, from our perspective, is most exciting is that if you look at the previous implementations of Beanstalk being in stasis or equilibrium, they never were as positive from a stats perspective or a macro perspective in terms of the health of Beanstalk. So from our perspective, it's not so important to rebuild momentum as much as it is just important for the protocol continue to demonstrate efficacy. But if the question around how to communicate the efficacy, I think that there's a lot to be said for if you look at how, for example, the pod rate has performed or the peg crosses have performed during other periods of stasis where there hasn't been demand or supply changes in beans, in the demand for supply of beans. This is a pretty encouraging time. So we remain patient, but recognize that sometimes it can be hard to remain patient. So if there's a desire for people, which is great, to spread the word or try to encourage to look again or take a first look at Beanstalk, there's certainly a lot of data that can be used to encourage them to do so. So we're pretty enthused on the momentum front, even though it seems like nothing's really happening on the momentum front. I think that might be a little bit of a misimpression, given that people have the memory of the pump for the month prior to the exploit and then the first couple weeks after the exploit. It's hard to remember that this is actually pretty normal, and the fact that the protocol is doing great when it's in such a normal state, that's pretty exciting. So not sure if that's exactly the answer Cool Bean looking for, but hopefully it's some helpful color on how we think about momentum. Like on Twitter or generally speaking, most I see like a lot of the common talk is that now is not the time, to do much and relax and just wait and observe on how, the market is behaving. And the sentiment is not only in crypto, it's also like in the overall market itself. Do you not think, and we go back again to what we discussed earlier at the start of this class, which was, how Beanstalk has performed in this past month. Given the market conditions and given how the sentiment and where we're in, do you not think that there is a lot of momentum with Beanstalk? I use the word impressed. I'm pretty impressed on how Beanstalk has performed.
Everything is relative. And I think relative to how Beanstalk was doing prior to the exploit, the momentum's not great. But relative to the current market conditions, the momentum really is great. Relative to the stablecoin market conditions, particularly the algo stable market conditions, Beanstalk's doing pretty great. Momentum's doing pretty great. So it's really just a question of what do you use as your benchmark. And I think it's good to reiterate that one thing that we are not focused on is speed, and the speed at which Beanstalk grows to 100 million or a billion or a trillion beans. Speed is not the goal. The goal is to continue to build good tech that whenever there is demand, because this is the best tech and it makes the most sense to use economically. That's really the thing that matters. We believe this will all sort itself out. So we're patient, and we think that just continuing to operate patiently and as safely as possible and continuing to build the best tech possible, that's really the key, and not focused as much on short-term momentum.
Thank you, Publius, for that answer. Nasjak is typing. If that's a question, we'll take it as the last question. Okay, not a question. Publius, thank you as always for your time to answering all of these questions. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll see you in next week's class.
Thanks, Man.